Deep in the heart of Montana's wilderness, far away from the noise and chaos of city life, there was a man who had built himself a little piece of paradise. This guy wasn't your typical homeowner. He was someone who valued peace, quiet, and freedom above all else. He'd spent years saving up, planning, and finally building a cozy cabin deep in the woods. It wasn't fancy or luxurious, but it was his sanctuary. Every log, every nail, every corner of that place held meaning for him. This man had seen more than most people could ever imagine. Before retreating to the mountains, he'd served as a sniper in the military. His career was filled with moments of bravery, sacrifice, and hardship. But after years of service, he decided it was time to leave that life behind. The thought of waking up to birds chirping instead of gunfire sounded like heaven to him. So he packed up his belongings, moved to Montana, and started a new life in the cabin was simple but fulfilling. Mornings began with a cup of strong coffee brewed over an open flame. Days were spent chopping wood, tending to his garden, fishing in the nearby stream, or just sitting on the porch watching the world go by. At night, the sky lit up with stars so bright they felt close enough to touch. For the first time in years, he felt truly at peace. But even in the middle of nowhere, trouble has a way of finding you. You see, this cabin wasn't completely isolated. There was a small community of homes not too far away, houses owned by folks who liked living near nature but still wanted modern comforts like paved roads and cable TV. These neighbors belonged to something called a homeowners association, HOA, which is basically a group of people who make rules about how everyone should live. Things like keeping your lawn tidy, painting your house certain colors, or making sure nothing blocks the scenic views of the mountains. Now, our guy didn't belong to this HOA because his land technically fell outside their jurisdiction, but that didn't stop them from trying to boss him around. They sent letter after letter, demanding he cut down some trees on his property that blocked their precious views. They also insisted he pay monthly dues, even though he wasn't part of their club. Each time, he ignored them. After all, he'd bought his land fair and square, and he wasn't about to let anyone tell him what to do with it. At first, the HOA members grumbled among themselves. "Who does he think he is?" one might have said. "He's ruining the neighborhood," another probably added. But soon, annoyance turned into anger. Their letters went unanswered, and their attempts to reason with him failed miserably. Frustrated and feeling powerless, they hatched a plan, one that would spiral out of control faster than they could have imagined. What they did next was shocking, reckless, and downright illegal. Instead of taking their grievances to court or finding a legal solution, they decided to take matters into their own hands. They hired a group of private security contractors, men dressed in tactical gear, carrying weapons and pretending to be police officers. The idea? To storm the cabin, intimidate the owner, and force him to comply with their demands. Little did these hotheads know what they were walking into. Sure, the cabin looked peaceful from the outside, but inside lived a man who knew exactly how to handle high-pressure situations. A man who had faced danger head-on countless times before. A man who wasn't afraid to stand his ground when threatened. And when those fake cops came rolling up his driveway one crisp autumn morning, guns drawn and shouting orders, they had no idea they were stepping into a nightmare of their own making. The stage was set for a showdown, unlike anything anyone expected. On one side, you had amateurs playing dress-up as law enforcement, convinced they could bully their way to victory. On the other, you had a seasoned professional who had spent years honing his skills in survival and strategy. What happened next would become the stuff of legends, or at least a lesson nobody involved would soon forget. The morning air was crisp, and the forest around the cabin was unusually quiet. The man inside had just finished his usual routine, brewing a pot of coffee over the stove. feeding scraps to the birds that always seemed to gather near his porch, and checking the traps he'd set along the edge of his property. It was shaping up to be another peaceful day in the wilderness, or so he thought. Suddenly, the silence was shattered. The sound of engines roaring up the dirt road leading to his cabin sent a jolt through him. He froze for a moment, listening intently. Who could it be? No one ever came this far out unless they were lost or looking for him specifically. And given his recent run-ins with the HOA, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Peering through a gap in the wooden blinds, he saw 3 large black SUVs skid to a stop right outside his driveway. Men poured out of the vehicles, dressed head to toe in tactical gear black uniforms, helmets, vests, and boots. They moved quickly, spreading out around the cabin like soldiers on a mission. Some carried rifles, while others held flashlights and what looked like communication devices. One of them shouted loudly, "Come out with your hands where we can see them." His heart raced, but years of training kicked in almost instantly. He didn't panic. Instead, he took a deep breath and forced himself to think clearly. Something about these men felt wrong. Their movements weren't smooth or coordinated like real law enforcement officers. Their uniforms didn't match perfectly. One guy wore a patch that looked handmade, while another's helmet strap hung loose. Plus, there were no marked police cars, no badges visible from where he stood. This wasn't an official raid. It was something else entirely. He knew better than to step outside blindly. Instead, he retreated silently into the depths of the cabin. Hidden beneath a trapdoor in the floor was a small, reinforced safe room he'd built during his first winter. Here. It wasn't big, just enough space for a cot, some supplies, and a few essentials, but it was secure. More importantly, it gave him access to a network of cameras he'd installed around the property. These cameras allowed him to monitor every inch of his land without being seen. As he slipped into the safe room and closed the heavy door behind him, the shouting grew louder. The men outside were growing impatient. One of them kicked open the front door, sending splinters flying across the room. Another smashed a window with the butt of his rifle. They stormed in, yelling commands and searching every corner of the cabin. But the place was empty, or so it seemed. Inside the safe room, the man watched their every move on a small monitor connected to the cameras. His lips curled into a faint smile as he observed their chaos. These guys clearly weren't professionals. One stumbled over a pile of firewood stacked neatly by the fireplace, cursing under his breath. Another accidentally discharged his weapon when he tripped on a rug, causing everyone to freeze in panic for a few seconds. Their lack of discipline was glaringly obvious. Despite their amateurish behavior, the situation was still dangerous. These men were armed, and they clearly intended to scare him into submission, but the man wasn't afraid. In fact, he found their antics almost comical. He'd faced far worse threats in his past life, and he knew exactly how to handle this kind of scenario. For now, he decided to wait. Let them waste their energy tearing apart his home. Let them grow frustrated and sloppy. Patience was key. Hours passed, and the intruders became increasingly agitated. They tore through drawers, flipped over furniture, and even pried open cabinets in search of anything valuable or anyone hiding. But they found nothing. The cabin was surprisingly sparse, filled only with basic necessities and a few personal belongings. Frustration bubbled over as tempers flared. One of the men slammed his fist against the wall, leaving a dent. Another muttered angrily about how this guy must be crazy to live like this. Outside, the temperature began to drop as the sun dipped below the horizon. Shadows stretched long across the forest floor, and the wind picked up, carrying with it the sharp bite of autumn. The cold seeped into the cabin, making the invaders visibly uncomfortable. Without proper preparation for such conditions, they huddled together, rubbing their hands and stamping their feet to stay warm. Their confidence wavered, replaced by unease. Back in the safe room, the man noticed their change in demeanor. He knew it was time to act. Reaching for a switch mounted on the wall, he activated a device he'd built himself, a custom noise generator designed to mimic the sound of approaching helicopters. Within seconds, the whirring blades echoed through the trees, accompanied by flashing red and blue lights visible through the windows. To the intruders, it sounded and looked exactly like backup arriving real law enforcement closing in fast. Panic erupted among the fake cops. They scrambled outside, abandoning their search and shouting at each other to regroup. In the confusion, the man emerged quietly from his safe room. Moving swiftly and silently, he positioned himself strategically, ensuring he had control of the situation without firing a single shot. By the time the intruders realized they'd been duped, it was too late. They were completely surrounded and disarmed. What started as a reckless attempt to intimidate a lone homeowner had turned into a humiliating defeat for the would-be enforcers. And as the night wore on, the man couldn't help but feel a sense of grim satisfaction. These people had underestimated him, and now they were paying the price for their arrogance. The chaos outside the cabin was reaching a fever pitch. The fake cops, now convinced that real law enforcement was closing in, were losing their grip on the situation entirely. Their panicked shouts echoed through the trees as they stumbled around in the dark, trying to figure out what to do next. Some of them clutched their weapons tightly, scanning the woods for signs of movement, while others frantically called their bosses on their radios, begging for instructions. But there was no one to guide them. They were alone, scared, and completely out of their depth. Back inside the cabin, the man stepped cautiously into the main room. He didn't need to rush. He knew he had the upper hand now. His trap had worked perfectly. The noise generator and flashing lights had done exactly what he'd hoped. They'd spooked the intruders into thinking backup was arriving. And once fear takes hold, it's hard to shake loose. These men weren't trained soldiers or even seasoned security professionals. They were hired guns playing dress-up, and their confidence was crumbling fast. He moved silently, his boots making barely a sound on the wooden floor. Years of experience had taught him how to stay calm under pressure, how to think several steps ahead of his opponents. As he reached the doorway, he paused for a moment, listening. Outside, the commotion continued. One of the men tripped over a fallen branch and cursed loudly. Another shouted something about getting out of here before it's too late. It was clear they were falling apart. With careful precision, the man slipped out of the cabin and into the shadows of the forest. He didn't need to confront them. Directly, not yet. Instead, he used the cover of darkness to circle around behind them, positioning himself so he could keep an eye on their every move. From his vantage point, he could see their faces illuminated faintly by the glow of their flashlights. Fear was written all over them: wide eyes, trembling hands, hunched shoulders. They looked like cornered animals, desperate to escape. And then, without warning, the man made his presence known. Stepping forward just enough to catch their attention, he called out in a firm, commanding voice, "Drop your weapons, now." The effect was immediate. The intruders froze, their flashlights swinging wildly in his direction. For a moment, nobody moved. Then, slowly, one by one, they lowered their rifles and pistols to the ground. None of them dared to argue or resist. They'd come here expecting to intimidate a lone homeowner, but instead, they'd walk straight into a nightmare. This wasn't some ordinary guy living off the grid. This was someone who knew how to handle himself. Someone who wasn't afraid to fight back if pushed too far. Once their weapons were on the ground, the man instructed them to gather near the barn at the edge of the property. He kept his distance, watching carefully to ensure none of them tried anything stupid. Despite his calm demeanor, there was an undeniable authority in his voice, an authority that came from years of training and experience. These men might have been bigger and younger than him, but they were no match for his discipline and focus. As they shuffled toward the barn, the tension in the air was palpable. The intruders exchanged nervous glances, whispering to each other in hushed tones. One of them muttered, "What did we get ourselves into?" Another shook his head, muttering curses under his breath. None of them had expected this outcome when they accepted the job. They'd been promised easy money, a quick scare tactic to force the homeowner into compliance. But nothing about this situation felt easy anymore. Inside the barn, the man tied them up securely, using rope he kept stored there for emergencies. He worked quickly and efficiently, making sure they couldn't break free but avoiding unnecessary roughness. There was no need to escalate things further. He'd already proven his point. Once they were secured, he stepped back and took a deep breath. The adrenaline coursing through his veins began to subside, replaced by a strange mix of relief and disbelief. He'd prepared for situations like this ever since building the cabin, but he never imagined he'd actually have to use those preparations. Now came the hardest part, deciding what to do next. He knew he couldn't let these men go without consequences. They'd broken the law, invaded his home, and put him in danger. At the same time, he didn't want to take justice into his own hands. That wasn't who he was. So he picked up his phone and dialed the local sheriff's department. His voice was steady as he explained the situation, giving them as much detail as possible. He didn't sugarcoat anything or try to play the hero. He simply told the truth about what had happened. When the deputies arrived, they were stunned by what they found. 3 men dressed in tactical gear, tied up in a barn, claiming they were working for the HOA. It sounded like something out of a movie, not real life. But as the deputies began questioning the intruders, the pieces started falling into place. One of the men admitted they'd been hired to pose as police officers and intimidate the homeowner. Another reluctantly handed over documents linking them to the HOA board members who had orchestrated the whole thing. The deputies' expression shifted from shock to anger as they realized the gravity of the situation. What these men had done wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. Impersonating law enforcement officers is a serious crime, and the HOA had crossed a line they couldn't come back from. The deputies wasted no time arresting the intruders and confiscating their gear. As they loaded them into patrol cars, one of the deputies turned to the homeowner and said, "You handled yourself well. Most people wouldn't have stayed as calm as you did." The man nodded, but he didn't say much. He was still processing everything that had happened. Part of him felt vindicated. These people had tried to bully him, and they'd failed miserably. But another part of him felt sad. Sad that things had escalated to this point, that neighbors would stoop so low just because they disagreed with how he lived his life. It was a sobering reminder that even in the most peaceful places, conflict can find you. As the sun began to rise over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the man stood on his porch and watched the deputies drive away. The cabin was quiet again, but it wasn't the same kind of quiet as before. The events of the night lingered in the air, heavy and unmistakable. He knew his life here in the wilderness wouldn't be the same after this. Word would spread about what had happened, and people would talk. Some might call him brave, others reckless. But none of that mattered to him right now. All that mattered was that he'd protected his home and himself from those who thought they could push him around. And as he sipped a fresh cup of coffee, watching the light creep through the trees, he reminded himself of why he'd chosen this life in the first place. Freedom, peace, solitude. Those were worth fighting for. Matter the cost. The days following the raid were anything but ordinary. News of what had happened spread like wildfire, first through the small community near the cabin and then far beyond. People couldn't stop talking about it, how a group of fake cops had stormed a remote cabin in the woods, only to be outsmarted by the very man they'd come to intimidate. It was the kind of story that seemed too wild to be true, yet every detail checked out. And as more information came to light, the scandal grew bigger and uglier. Local newspapers picked up the story almost immediately. Reporters swarmed the area, setting up cameras and microphones outside the cabin, hoping to get an interview with the homeowner. TV crews parked their vans along the dirt road leading to his property, kicking up clouds of dust as they jockeyed for position. At first, the man stayed out of sight, letting the buzz build without adding fuel to the fire. He wasn't interested in becoming some kind of celebrity or internet sensation. But he also knew silence could be misinterpreted, so after a few days, he agreed to speak briefly with one reporter, a local journalist known for being fair and respectful. Sitting on his porch, dressed in simple jeans and a flannel shirt, the man recounted the events calmly and matter-of-factly. He didn't embellish or dramatize. He simply told the truth. He explained how the HOA had harassed him for months over trivial things like trees, blocking views, and unpaid dues. He described the night the fake cops showed up, how they'd kicked down his door and ransacked his home, thinking they could scare him into submission. And finally, he talked about how he'd managed to turn the tables on them using nothing but patience, strategy, and a little ingenuity. His words struck a chord with people. Some saw him as a hero, a symbol of standing up to bullies and fighting for your rights. Others admired his resourcefulness, marveling at how he'd handled such a dangerous situation without resorting to violence. Social media exploded with hashtags like #CabinHero and #StandYourGround, with thousands sharing memes and posts praising his actions. Strangers sent messages of support, calling him the ultimate neighbor and saying they wished they had half his courage. But not everyone was on his side. Critics emerged, accusing him of going too far. They argued that tying up the intruders and holding them until deputies arrived was excessive, even if those intruders had broken the law. A few pundits on cable news shows debated whether he should face charges himself, claiming self-defense didn't justify detaining someone indefinitely. These voices were loud, but they were drowned out by the overwhelming majority who sided with him. After all, most people understood the difference between defending yourself and escalating a conflict unnecessarily, and this clearly wasn't the latter. Meanwhile, the fallout for the HOA was catastrophic. Once the identities of the board members involved were revealed, their lives became a living nightmare. Neighbors who had once supported them turned against them, outraged by their illegal tactics. People canceled memberships, refusing to associate with an organization that would stoop so low. Lawsuits piled up, with residents demanding refunds for dues paid under false pretenses. By the end of the week, the entire board had resigned in disgrace, leaving the HOA in shambles. The intruders themselves faced serious consequences. Arrested and charged with impersonating police officers, trespassing, and several other crimes, they appeared in court looking pale and defeated. During the trial, evidence surfaced showing they'd been hired directly by the HOA, complete with emails and text messages detailing the plan. The judge spared no mercy, handing down hefty fines and jail time for each of them. As the gavel fell, the courtroom erupted in applause, a rare moment of public satisfaction in a legal system often criticized for leniency. For the homeowner, the aftermath was bittersweet. On one hand, justice had been served. The people responsible for violating his privacy and threatening his safety were held accountable. On the other hand, the ordeal left scars, not physical ones, but emotional ones. Living alone in the wilderness had always been about finding peace, but now that peace felt fragile. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle in the trees reminded him of that night. He couldn't shake the feeling that trouble might find him again, no matter how prepared he was. Still, he refused to let fear dictate his life. Instead, he channeled his energy into something positive. Inspired by the outpouring of support he'd received, he decided to share his knowledge with others. He began hosting workshops on survival skills, teaching people how to protect themselves and live off the grid if needed. Topics ranged from building secure shelters to setting up surveillance systems, all delivered in a way that was practical and easy to understand. Word spread quickly, and soon folks from neighboring towns and even other states started showing up to learn from him. These workshops weren't just about survival, though. They were also about empowerment. The man made it clear that preparation wasn't about paranoia. It was about taking control of your own destiny. You don't have to wait for someone else to solve your problems, he'd say during sessions. Whether it's learning how to fix a leaky roof or standing up to bullies, you've got the power to handle whatever comes your way. His message resonated deeply, especially in a world where uncertainty seemed to lurk around every corner. As weeks turned into months, the initial frenzy surrounding the incident began to die down. Reporters stopped camping outside his cabin, and the hashtags faded from social media feeds. Life returned to its usual rhythm, or as close to it as possible. The man continued working on his property, chopping wood, fishing, and tending to his garden. But there was a new sense of purpose in everything he did. He realized he'd become a voice for people who felt powerless, a reminder that standing up for yourself doesn't mean picking fights, it means refusing to back down when it matters most. One evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sunset, he reflected on everything that had happened. The raid, the arrest, the media circus, it all felt surreal, like something out of a movie. Yet here he was, still standing, still free. He thought about the lessons he'd learned, not just about protecting his home, but about human nature itself. About how greed and entitlement can drive people to do terrible things, but also about how resilience and determination can overcome even the toughest challenges. In the distance, a hawk soared across the sky, its wings gliding effortlessly on the breeze. For a moment, the man allowed himself to feel at peace. Whatever the future held, he knew he'd face it head on. Because at the end of the day, that's what freedom meant to him. The ability to choose how you live, no matter who tries to tell you otherwise. Months had passed since the raid, and while life in the cabin had returned to its quiet rhythm, things were different now. The man felt a shift, not just in himself, but in the world around him. His story had touched people in ways he never expected, sparking conversations about rights, freedom, and what it means to stand up for yourself. It wasn't fame or recognition that changed him. It was the realization that his actions had inspired others to take control of their own lives. The workshops he started became more than just lessons on survival skills. They turned into something bigger. People came from all walks of life. Young families looking to live off the grid, retirees wanting to reconnect with nature, even city dwellers curious about self-reliance. Some showed up skeptical, unsure if they could really learn anything useful. But by the time they left, most were transformed, not because they'd mastered building a fire or setting traps, but because they'd discovered a newfound confidence within themselves. One weekend, a middle-aged woman arrived at the cabin with her teenage son. She explained that she'd been struggling to find hope after losing her job and going through a divorce. Her son barely spoke anymore, retreating into video games and shutting everyone out. They weren't sure what to expect from the workshop, but they figured it couldn't hurt to try. Over 2 days, the man taught them how to construct a simple shelter using materials found in the forest. He showed them how to identify edible plants and purify water from a stream. By the end of it, both mother and son were smiling, laughing, even as they worked together to light a fire without matches. When they thanked him before leaving, tears welled up in the woman's eyes. "You've given us more than just tools," she said. "You've given us hope. It wasn't always easy, though." Hosting these workshops meant opening his secluded world to strangers, which didn't come naturally to someone who valued solitude so deeply. There were moments when he questioned whether he was doing the right thing. Late at night, sitting alone by the fire, he'd wonder if sharing his knowledge might somehow invite more trouble into his life. After all, not everyone who attended the workshops had pure intentions. A few participants asked uncomfortable questions about firearms or surveillance systems, hinting at ulterior motives. But the man trusted his instincts. If someone seemed off, he kept a close eye on them and made sure they left empty-handed. Despite the occasional doubts, there was no denying the impact he was having. Letters poured in from people across the country, thanking him for inspiring them to make changes in their own lives. Some shared stories of standing up to landlords or employers who tried to push them around. Others talked about starting gardens, learning basic carpentry, or teaching their kids outdoor skills. Each letter reminded him why he'd chosen this path, to show people that they didn't have to be victims of circumstance. Even in the face of adversity, there was always a way forward. Of course, not everything was sunshine and rainbows. The HOA scandal continued to ripple through the community. Long after the board members resigned, lawsuits dragged on, pitting neighbor against neighbor as residents fought over property lines, fees, and responsibilities. Some blamed the man for tearing the community apart, accusing him of stirring up trouble. He heard whispers here and there, comments muttered under breaths at the grocery store or glares from passing cars. But he didn't let it bother him. He knew he hadn't caused the division. He'd simply exposed cracks that had been there all along. What surprised him most was how many neighbors reached out privately to thank him. At first, they did so cautiously, afraid of being seen as traitors to the HOA cause. But over time, their gratitude grew bolder. One elderly couple brought him homemade pies, explaining that they'd hated the HOAS rules for years but never had the courage to speak out. Another family invited him to dinner, telling him how his actions gave them the confidence to sell their home and move somewhere less restrictive. These small gestures meant more to him than any headline or hashtag ever could. They reminded him that change often starts quietly, one person at a time. As winter approached, the man prepared his cabin for the colder months ahead. Snow would soon blanket the forest, turning the landscape into a frozen wonderland. He chopped extra wood, stocked up on supplies, and reinforced the roof to handle heavy snowfall. But this year, he added something new: a guest room. Not because he planned to entertain visitors regularly, but because he wanted a space where people could stay if they needed help. Maybe it was someone stranded during a storm, or maybe it was a workshop participant who traveled too far to drive home safely. Whatever the reason, he liked the idea of offering shelter to those in need. On Christmas Eve, as snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky, he sat by the fire with a cup of hot cocoa in hand. Outside, the world was hushed, wrapped in a serene stillness that only winter could bring. Inside, the cabin was warm and cozy, filled with the faint scent of pine and burning logs. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to feel content, not just with his life, but with the choices he'd made. Yes, the raid had shaken him. Yes, it had forced him to confront parts of himself he'd rather forget. But it had also shown him the strength he carried inside and the difference one person could make. That night, as he drifted off to sleep, he thought about the future. He didn't know what challenges lay ahead, but he was ready for them. The wilderness had taught him that storms pass, seasons change, and nothing stays the same forever. Life was unpredictable, messy, and sometimes unfair, but it was also beautiful. And as long as he stayed true to himself, he knew he'd weather whatever came next. When morning broke, sunlight streamed through the windows, casting golden patterns on the wooden floor. The man stepped outside, breathing in the crisp air and taking in the view. The forest stretched endlessly before him, untouched and wild. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, its voice carrying across the land like a song. He smiled, feeling a deep connection to the place he called home and to the people whose lives he'd touched along the way. Life wasn't perfect, and it probably never would be. But for now, it was enough.